5,000 people are dead, not from natural causes, not from accidents. They died because a pharmaceutical company chose profit over human lives. For over a decade, executives at Meridian Pharmaceuticals knew their blockbuster heart medication, CardioSafe, was causing fatal blood clots. They had the data, they saw the death reports, and they buried it all. Internal emails reveal a chilling conspiracy executives calculating that paying out wrongful death settlements would be cheaper than pulling a $12 billion a year drug from the market. Regulatory officials were paid off, whistleblowers were silenced, families were left grieving, never knowing the truth, but one lawyer refused to let them get away with it. I'm Mike, and for the past 3 years I've been fighting to expose the biggest pharmaceutical cover-up in American history. This is the story of corporate greed, regulatory betrayal, and the battle for justice that the powerful hoped would never see the light of day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The conference room was quiet, except for the hum of the recorder between us. Mike sat across from me, his case files stacked in neat piles, years of investigation condensed into folders that held the stories of thousands of lives cut short. His expression was measured, controlled, but I could see the weight of what he was about to share. Let me start with Allison Hughes, he began, leaning forward slightly. She was 42 years old, a high school teacher in Ohio, married, 2 kids. She had a minor heart arrhythmia, nothing life-threatening. Her doctor prescribed CardioSafe in March 2019. It was supposed to regulate her heartbeat, keep her healthy. 6 months later, she collapsed in her classroom in front of her students. He paused, and I watched him choose his next words carefully. Massive pulmonary embolism. Blood clot that traveled to her lungs. She was dead before the ambulance arrived. Her husband, Matthew, found out while he was at work, got the call that every spouse dreads. The doctors told him it was sudden, unexpected, a tragic medical event. They made it sound like bad luck. The way he said those last 2 words, bad luck, carried an edge that made it clear this was anything but. But it wasn't bad luck, was it? I asked. Mike shook his head slowly. Matthew didn't know that then. None of them did. Allison was just one name on a death certificate. Cause of death, pulmonary embolism. What the certificate didn't say, what nobody told Matthew, was that CardioSafe had a side effect that Meridian Pharmaceuticals knew about. The drug increased the risk of fatal blood clots by 340%. I felt my stomach tighten. 340%? 340%, he repeated. And Meridian knew. They had the clinical trial data. They had post-market surveillance reports. They knew patients were dying, and they said nothing. He pulled a photograph from one of the folders and slid it across the table. A woman with warm eyes and a bright smile, her arms around 2 teenage boys. That's Allison with her sons, Jeremy and Marcus. She taught English literature. She volunteered at the food bank every Saturday. She was supposed to watch Jeremy graduate next year. His voice remained steady, professional, but there was something beneath it, a quiet fury that he kept tightly leashed. Matthew spent 2 years thinking his wife's death was random, a fluke. He grieved, he raised their boys alone, and he never questioned it. What changed, I asked. A news article, Mike said, December 2021, a small piece in a medical journal about CardioSafe and increased thrombotic events. Matthew saw it online. He didn't even know what thrombotic events meant at first, but something made him dig deeper. He called me 3 days later. Mike opened another folder, and I saw pages of medical records, lab reports, pharmaceutical documentation. When Matthew came to my office, he brought everything: Allison's medical records, her prescription history, the autopsy report. He asked me one question: is it possible the medication killed my wife? I told him I'd look into it. What I found was worse than either of us imagined. He spread several documents across the table, internal company emails with subject lines that made my blood run cold. Risk assessment update, market impact analysis, liability projection Q3. These are from Meridian's internal communications, Mike explained. We obtained them through discovery later, but I'm showing you now so you understand what we were dealing with. This is an email from Victor Malone, the CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals, to his executive team, dated April 2018, a full year before Allison was prescribed CardioSafe. He pointed to a highlighted section, and I read it aloud. Continued reports of thromboembolic events in CardioSafe patients. Legal recommends risk mitigation strategy. Finance project settlement costs at $480 million over 5 years. Annual revenue $12.3 billion. Recommendation, maintain current market position. I looked up at Mike, not quite believing what I just read. They did a cost-benefit analysis on human lives. They calculated that it was cheaper to let people die and pay settlements than to pull their drug from the market, Mike said flatly. CardioSafe was generating over $1 billion a month. They decided that 5,000 deaths, which is what their own internal projections estimated, was an acceptable business cost. The room felt smaller suddenly. The weight of those words, acceptable business cost, hung in the air between us. How many people knew, I asked? The executive leadership team, legal department, key members of their regulatory affairs division. We're talking about at least 24 people at the highest levels of the company who saw the data and chose to do nothing. Worse than nothing, they actively worked to suppress it. Mike pulled out another document, this one stamped with FDA letterhead. In June 2019, 3 months after Allison started taking CardioSafe, a pharmacovigilance specialist at the FDA named Cooper Ellis flagged the drug for review. He'd noticed a pattern statistically significant increase in thromboembolic events among CardioSafe patients compared to other medications in the same class. He recommended an immediate safety investigation. What happened to his recommendation? Mike's expression darkened. It disappeared, never made it past his supervisor. Cooper submitted the report through official channels, and it vanished into the bureaucratic void. He tried to escalate it 3 times. Each time, he was told the data was inconclusive, that the sample size was too small, that there were confounding variables. He was stonewalled at every turn. Why? Because 2 members of the FDA advisory panel responsible for cardiovascular drugs had previously worked for Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Another had received research grants totaling $3.2 million from Meridian over the previous 5 years. The regulatory system that was supposed to protect patients had been compromised. I sat back trying to process the scale of what he was describing. This wasn't just corporate negligence. This was systematic corruption, Mike finished. Meridian didn't just hide the deaths. They engineered a system to ensure nobody could hold them accountable. They had people inside the regulatory agency. They had legal teams ready to bury anyone who asked questions. They had PR firms prepared to discredit whistleblowers. How did you break through it? Matthew wasn't the only one who'd lost someone, Mike said. Once we started digging, we found others. Kendall Harper in Florida, whose daughter Zoe died at 29 from a stroke after taking CardioSafe for 6 months. Logan Martinez in Texas, whose wife Faith collapsed during a morning jog. All the same pattern, prescribed CardioSafe, developed blood clots, died suddenly. And every single one of them had been told it was just bad luck. He gathered the documents back into the folder, his movements precise and controlled. We started building the case in early 2022. It took us 8 months just to get through Meridian's legal obstacles, motions to dismiss, demands for arbitration, attempts to seal documents. They fought us every step of the way, but we had something they didn't count on. What was that? Mike looked at me directly, and for the first time I saw something beyond the professional composure, a hint of the determination that had driven him through years of this fight. We had Cooper Ellis, the FDA specialist who'd tried to blow the whistle. He'd kept copies of everything, every report he'd filed, every email where he'd been shut down, every piece of evidence that Meridian had people inside the agency protecting them. And he was ready to testify. That must have been the breakthrough you needed. It should have been, Mike said quietly. But 3 weeks after Cooper agreed to testify, something happened that changed everything. He paused and I waited, knowing that whatever came next was the reason his expression had grown so grim. Cooper Ellis died in a single car accident on a rural highway outside Bethesda. His car went off the road, hit a tree, no other vehicles involved. The police ruled it an accident, said he must have fallen asleep at the wheel. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Do you think, I think Mike interrupted, his voice low and controlled, that the night before Cooper died, he called me at 11 p.m. and said he'd found something new, something bigger than the blood clot data. He said he had evidence that Meridian's corruption went beyond the FDA, that there were congressional staffers involved, that the cover-up was more extensive than we'd realized. He was supposed to meet me the next morning to hand over the documents. Did he? Mike's jaw tightened. He never made it. And when the police searched his car after the accident, the documents were gone. His laptop was missing. His phone was wiped clean. The official story was that he'd been drinking. They found a bottle of whiskey in the car, but Cooper didn't drink. He'd been sober for 15 years. I felt a chill run down my spine. What did you do? I realized we weren't just fighting a pharmaceutical company, Mike said. We were fighting something much bigger, something that would kill to protect itself. And if we were going to win, if we were going to get justice for Allison and Zoe and Faith and the 5,000 others who died, we had to be smarter, more careful, and more determined than they were ruthless. Quick pause. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. So I made a choice. I decided that no matter what it cost me, no matter who tried to stop us, I was going to expose every single person who'd played a part in burying those deaths. And I was going to make sure the world knew exactly what Meridian Pharmaceuticals had done. The recorder between us continued its quiet hum, capturing every word. The question was, Mike said softly, how far would they go to stop me? The coffee between us had gone cold, but neither of us noticed. Mike had that look people get when they're reliving something that changed them, not quite haunted, but marked by it in a way that never fully fades. After Cooper's death, everything changed. He said, the case went from difficult to dangerous. Matthew wanted to pull out. He had his sons to think about, and he was terrified. I didn't blame him. But then something happened that neither of us expected. He pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through emails, then turned the screen toward me. 3 days after Cooper's accident made the local news, I received this. The email was brief, sent from a generic address with no name attached. But the message was clear. I know what happened to Cooper Ellis. I know what Meridian did. I have proof. We need to talk. Who sent it? I asked. At first, I didn't know. I've learned to be cautious, especially in a case. The precautions themselves told a story. This was someone who understood surveillance, who knew how to avoid being monitored. When I walked into that coffee shop, Mike continued, I didn't know what to expect. What I got was a woman in her mid-30s, well-dressed professional, sitting in the back corner with her laptop closed and her phone face down on the table. She looked terrified. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Her name was Tessa McCarthy. She worked in Meridian's Regulatory Affairs Department, had been there for 8 years. She'd been one of the people responsible for managing the company's communications with the FDA, tracking adverse event reports, compiling safety data. She knew everything. Why did she reach out to you? Because Cooper Ellis had been her friend. They'd worked together before he joined the FDA back when he was in private sector pharmaceutical research. When she heard about his accident, she knew immediately it wasn't random. She knew because she'd seen what Meridian was capable of when people became problems. Mike opened another folder, this one thicker than the others, packed with printed spreadsheets and data tables. Tessa brought me something that changed the entire trajectory of the case. It was an internal database, a complete record of every adverse event report Meridian had received about CardioSafe from 2017 to 2022. Over 14, cero reports, 247 deaths, and a separate file showing which reports had been submitted to the FDA and which ones had been, in their words, internally resolved. Meaning buried, I said. Exactly. Out of 14,000 adverse events, Meridian had reported fewer than 2,000 to the FDA. The rest simply disappeared into their internal systems. Deaths that should have triggered investigations were classified as unrelated to medication or insufficient data for causation. They had an entire department dedicated to making sure the real numbers never saw daylight. He spread the spreadsheets across the table and I saw rows upon rows of names, dates, causes of death. Each line represented a person, someone's parent, child, spouse, friend. Tessa also gave me something else. Mike said, communications between Meridian executives and FDA officials, emails, meeting notes, records of phone calls. It was proof of what Cooper had discovered, that the corruption went beyond just having former employees on advisory panels. Meridian had been actively coordinating with people inside the FDA to suppress safety reviews, delay investigations, and discredit internal whistleblowers. How is that even possible? Money and access, Mike said bluntly. One email chain showed a Meridian senior VP, Reed Palmer, arranging a consulting contract for an FDA supervisor, $180,000 a year, for what was described as advisory services. Another showed the company paying for an FDA official's daughter attend a private college. They weren't just influencing the system, they'd bought pieces of it. I thought about Cooper Ellis, the whistleblower who'd tried to do the right thing, whose concerns had been systematically dismissed. How many people inside the FDA were involved? Tessa's documents showed at least 7 officials at various levels who'd received payments, gifts, or favors from Meridian. Some might have genuinely believed they weren't doing anything wrong, that the consulting was legitimate, that the research grants were standard practice, but the pattern was clear. Every single one of them had at some point intervened to protect CardioSafe from scrutiny. Mike pulled out a specific email, this one marked with a red flag in the corner. This is from Victor Malone, the CEO, to his executive team, sent 2 weeks after Cooper Ellis filed his 3rd attempt to get CardioSafe reviewed. It says, FDA situation contained. Our friend in pharmacovigilance confirms no further escalation expected. Continue monitoring, but no immediate action required. Their friend, I repeated, they're openly discussing having someone inside the FDA working for them. They felt untouchable, Mike said, and why wouldn't they? They'd been operating this way for years without consequences. CardioSafe wasn't even their first drug with hidden risks. We found evidence of similar patterns with 2 other medications they'd released in the previous decade. They'd perfected the art of regulatory capture. What did Tessa want in exchange for this information? Protection, Mike said simply, and I couldn't give it to her. Not really. I could offer her whistleblower status, legal representation, the hope that exposing the truth would keep her safe through visibility. But we both knew what had happened to Cooper. She was taking an enormous risk. Did she hesitate? No, Mike said. And there was something like admiration in his voice. She told me she'd been carrying the weight of those deaths for years, that she'd watched executives celebrate quarterly earnings while she filed away reports of people dying. She said she couldn't do it anymore, couldn't be complicit, even if it cost her everything. He paused, and I saw the shadow cross his face again. 2 months later, Tessa was fired from Meridian. They claimed it was performance-related, completely unconnected to any legal matters, but we knew better. They discovered she'd leaked documents, and they were sending a message. She couldn't find work anywhere in the pharmaceutical industry. After that, she'd been blacklisted. Last I heard, she was working retail, struggling to pay her rent. That's retaliation. It is. Look, we filed a complaint, but these things take years to resolve, and in the meantime, she's paying the price for doing the right thing. That's what happens when you go up against companies with unlimited resources and no conscience. They don't just fight back. They destroy you financially, professionally, personally. They make an example out of you so others won't dare follow. I thought about the families who'd lost loved ones, the whistleblowers who tried to speak up, the systematic machinery designed to protect profit at any cost. With Tessa's documents, did you finally have enough to move forward? We had enough to file, Mike said, but filing was the easy part. Making it stick was something else entirely. Meridian's legal team was led by Eric Sutton, one of the best defense attorneys in the country. They came at us with everything. Motions to dismiss based on federal preemption, arguing that FDA approval shielded them from state liability. Demands that our evidence be excluded because of how it was obtained. Attacks on our expert witnesses. They tried to get me disqualified from the case, claiming conflict of interest. How did you respond? We fought every single motion. It took 14 months just to survive the pre-trial phase. But here's what Meridian didn't count on. Every time they tried to suppress evidence, every time they filed another motion to delay or dismiss, they drew more attention to the case. Reporters started calling, other attorneys reached out, and more families came forward. He pulled out a legal document, the front page, showing Hughes et al. V. Meridian Pharmaceuticals class action complaint. By mid-2023, we had 847 families signed on as plaintiffs, 847 deaths, all following the same pattern, all CardioSafe patients who developed fatal blood clots. Meridian couldn't dismiss us as an outlier anymore. They were facing a tsunami of liability. How did they react? They offered to settle, Mike said, called me directly, bypassed all official channels, offered $400 million to make the whole thing go away. Confidential settlement, no admission of wrongdoing, all documents sealed. They wanted to pay us to stay quiet. I waited knowing there was more. I took the offer back to my clients, all 847 families, told them what it meant. Roughly $470,000 per family after legal fees. Life-changing money for many of them. But it came with a price. They could never speak publicly about what Meridian had done. The documents would be sealed. The executives would face no consequences. And CardioSafe would remain on the market. What did they say? Mike's expression hardened with something that looked like pride. Matthew Hughes spoke for most of them. He said, my wife didn't die so I could get a check and shut up. She died because these people chose money over human lives. If we take this settlement, nothing changes. They'll do it again with the next drug and someone else's wife will die. So no, we don't want their money. We want justice. The silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of that decision, families choosing principle over financial security, choosing to continue a fight that had already cost them so much. So you turned it down, I said. We turned it down, Mike confirmed. And that's when Meridian's strategy changed. They tried to buy us off and it hadn't worked. They'd tried to bury us in legal motions and we'd survived. So they decided to destroy our credibility instead. He pulled out a newspaper clipping and I recognized the publication, a major national outlet known for investigative reporting. 3 weeks after we rejected their settlement, this article appeared. Opportunistic lawyers exploit grieving families in pharmaceutical witch hunt. It painted me as an ambulance chaser, suggested our clients were being manipulated, claimed the science didn't support our case. The article was written by a respected journalist, someone with a solid reputation. Let me guess, I said. Meridian was behind it. We couldn't prove it initially, but yes. We later discovered through discovery that Meridian had paid a PR firm $2.3 million to place favorable stories and discredit our case. They didn't write the article directly. They were smarter than that. They fed information to journalists, provided independent experts who contradicted our evidence, funded opinion pieces by doctors who defended CardioSafe. They manufactured doubt. Did it work? It made things harder. Some of our clients got scared, worried they were on the wrong side of the science. We had to spend time and resources countering the misinformation instead of building our case. But here's the thing about the truth, it's resilient. Meridian could pay for all the PR they wanted, but they couldn't change the fact that 5,000 people were dead and their own documents proved they'd known about the risk. Mike gathered the papers back together, his movements deliberate and controlled. By early 2024, we were ready for trial. We had the evidence, we had the witnesses, we had families prepared to testify about what they'd lost. Meridian had exhausted their pretrial motions. It was time to face a jury. You must have felt confident. I felt prepared, Mike corrected, but confident? No, not in a case like this, because I knew that even with all our evidence, all our witnesses, all the documentation showing exactly what Meridian had done, we were still up against a billion-dollar corporation with infinite resources and no moral boundaries. And I knew that they'd proven again and again that they were willing to do anything to protect themselves. He leaned forward, his expression grave. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was just how far that anything extended. We were about to find out that the corruption wasn't just at Meridian and the FDA. It went higher than we'd imagined. And when we discovered the truth, it put every single person involved in this case in danger. The trial was set to begin in 6 weeks. Mike and his team had spent months preparing, organizing evidence, prepping witnesses, building the narrative that would connect 5,000 deaths to a conspiracy of silence. Everything was in motion. Then, on a Tuesday morning in February 2024, Mike received a text message from an unknown number. It said, "You need to stop digging. You don't know what you're dealing with," Mike told me, showing me a screenshot he'd saved. No signature, no context, just a warning. Did you take it seriously? I get threats sometimes in cases like this. Usually they're from internet trolls or people with too much time on their hands. But this one felt different. It was specific. It knew we were digging, which suggested someone was watching our investigation closely. And it came 3 days after we'd filed a subpoena for certain congressional records. Congressional records, I asked, surprised. What did Congress have to do with a pharmaceutical lawsuit? Mike's expression turned grim. That's what we wanted to know. We filed a subpoena requesting communications between Meridian Pharmaceuticals and members of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. That's the committee with jurisdiction over the FDA and drug regulation. We were looking for evidence of political influence over the regulatory process. Did you get the records? Not exactly, Mike said. What we got was pushback. Immediate, aggressive pushback within 48 hours of filing the subpoena. We received a motion to quash from not just Meridian's lawyers, but from counsel representing the congressional committee itself. They argued executive privilege, separation of powers, every legal obstacle they could throw at us. And that's when I knew we'd hit something big. I thought about the text message warning him to stop digging. Someone was worried about what you'd find. Exactly. So we dug harder. We had a researcher on our team, a woman named Josie Warren, brilliant at following money trails. I asked her to look into campaign contributions, political donations, anything connecting Meridian to specific members of Congress. Mike opened his laptop and pulled up a spreadsheet, color-coded and dense with numbers. What Josie found was a web of financial connections that explained why Meridian felt untouchable. Over the previous 10 years, the company had donated $47 million to political campaigns, both parties, multiple levels of government. But the real story was in the specifics. He pointed to a highlighted section. 3 members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee had received substantial donations from Meridian and its executives. But more importantly, 2 of those members had spouses or close family members who worked as consultants for firms that did business exclusively with pharmaceutical companies. Another had accepted paid speaking fees from a foundation funded primarily by Meridian. Legal corruption, I said. It's all technically legal, Mike agreed. That's the genius of it. Campaign contributions, speaking fees, consulting contracts, they're all within the bounds of election law. But the result is the same. Politicians who are financially tied to the pharmaceutical industry are responsible for overseeing that same industry. It's a system designed to prevent meaningful accountability. How does that connect to the FDA issues you'd already uncovered? That's where it gets interesting, Mike said. The FDA is supposed to be independent, but Congress controls its budget and can influence its priorities through legislation and oversight hearings. If you have congressional allies, you can indirectly protect your interests at the regulatory level. He pulled up an email chain, this one with multiple recipients. This is from Victor Malone to his government affairs team. It was sent in March 2020, right around the time Cooper Ellis was trying to escalate his safety concerns about CardioSafe. It says, contact Congressman Ashton Bishop's office regarding FDA budget hearing. Emphasize our job creation numbers and express concerns about overzealous regulatory review hampering innovation. Ashton Bishop, I repeated, recognizing the name. At the time, he was the chairman of the subcommittee that controlled FDA funding. And he'd received over $340,000 in campaign contributions from Meridian and pharmaceutical industry PACs over the previous 3 election cycles. 2 months after this email was sent, Bishop held a hearing where he publicly criticized the FDA for what he called regulatory overreach that was stifling pharmaceutical innovation. Mike pulled up video footage from the hearing, and I watched as Congressman Bishop questioned FDA officials, pressing them about approval timelines and suggesting the agency was too cautious in its safety reviews. 3 weeks after that hearing, Mike continued, Cooper Ellis's supervisor, the one who'd been blocking his CardioSafe safety review, received a promotion. The acting director of the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation sent an agency-wide memo emphasizing the importance of efficient review processes and balanced risk assessment. The message was clear: don't slow down drug approvals. I was beginning to understand the scope of what Mike had uncovered, not just corporate corruption, but a system-wide failure that stretched from pharmaceutical boardrooms to regulatory agencies to the halls of Congress. When you tried to get the congressional records, I asked, what were you hoping to find? Proof of coordination, Mike said. We wanted to show that Meridian wasn't just making donations and hoping for the best. They were actively working with congressional allies to suppress oversight and protect CardioSafe from scrutiny. If we could prove that, it would demonstrate that the cover-up involved not just the company and the FDA, but elected officials who were supposed to be representing the public interest. Did you get your proof? Mike hesitated, and I sensed we were approaching something he'd been building toward. Not through the subpoena. The motion to quash was granted. We were blocked from accessing the congressional records. But sometimes proof comes from unexpected places. He pulled out a flash drive, holding it carefully as if it were something both precious and dangerous. 3 days after we received that text message warning me to stop digging, someone left this in my mailbox at home. No note, no explanation, just the drive. What was on it? Everything, Mike said quietly. Emails between Meridian executives and congressional staffers. Records of meetings between company lobbyists and committee members. Talking points that Meridian had written that showed up verbatim in congressional speeches defending the pharmaceutical industry. And most damning evidence that Congressman Bishop's chief of staff had personally intervened with the FDA on Meridian's behalf, pressuring them to dismiss Cooper Ellis's safety concerns. I stared at the flash drive. Who gave this to you? I don't know, Mike admitted. The metadata had been scrubbed. There was no way to trace where it came from. But whoever it was had access to communications between very powerful people, someone inside the system who wanted the truth to come out. Could it have been a setup, false evidence planted to discredit your case? That was my first thought. So we spent 2 weeks verifying everything on that drive, cross-referencing it with documents we'd already obtained, checking email headers, confirming dates and details. It was all legitimate, every single file. What did you do with it? We faced a choice, Mike said. The evidence was explosive. It could prove that Meridian's cover-up had political protection at the highest levels. But we'd obtained it through an anonymous source, possibly someone who'd violated confidentiality agreements or even broken laws to get it. If we tried to introduce it in court, Meridian would challenge its authenticity and argue it was inadmissible, so you couldn't use it in the trial. Not directly, but we could use it to guide our investigation. We knew what to look for now, and we knew where the connections were. So we filed new subpoenas, more targeted this time, requesting specific documents that we knew existed because we'd seen them on the flash drive. We forced Meridian and the congressional offices to produce the evidence through official channels. Did it work? Partially. We got some of the documents, enough to show a pattern of coordination between Meridian and congressional allies, enough to demonstrate that political influence had played a role in protecting CardioSafe from oversight. But the most damaging evidence, the direct communications showing Congressman Bishop's office interfering with the FDA, remained sealed under executive privilege claims. Mike closed his laptop and leaned back, his expression weary. By this point, we were a month out from trial. We had a strong case on the core issues. Meridian knew CardioSafe was deadly and concealed that information. We had the documents, the data, the whistleblower testimony. We could prove corporate negligence and fraud. But the full scope of the conspiracy, the political dimension, the corruption that had enabled the cover-up to continue for so long, that was still partly hidden. Were you worried? I was angry. Mike said. We'd uncovered systematic corruption involving a pharmaceutical company, federal regulators, and elected officials. We'd proven that 5,000 people had died because profits were prioritized over public safety. And yet the people at the top, the ones who'd engineered and protected this system, were still insulated by layers of legal privilege and political power. He picked up the flash drive again, turning it over in his hands. But I also knew we had something they couldn't take away from us, the truth. And we had 847 families who'd lost loved ones who were willing to stand up in court and tell their stories. Meridian could hide behind lawyers and political connections, but they couldn't hide from the human cost of what they'd done. When did the trial start? The 18th of March, 2024, federal courthouse in Philadelphia. The judge was Frank Caprio, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for not tolerating corporate games. Jury selection took 3 days. We ended up with 12 people, teachers, nurses, a retired electrician, a small business owner, regular people who'd be deciding whether one of the most powerful pharmaceutical companies in America was responsible for thousands of deaths. How did Meridian's team approach it? With overwhelming force, Mike said. Eric Sutton, their lead attorney, is a master at creating doubt. He didn't deny that people had died. He couldn't. But he argued that correlation wasn't causation, that the adverse events could be explained by underlying health conditions, that our statistical analysis was flawed. He brought in expert witnesses, doctors, pharmacologists, statisticians who testified that CardioSafe was safe and effective when used as prescribed. How did you counter that? With their own words, Mike said simply, we presented the internal documents showing that Meridian's own scientists had identified the blood clot risk. We showed the emails where executives discussed hiding the data. We put Tessa McCarthy on the stand, and she walked the jury through exactly how the company had suppressed adverse event reports. And we brought in families, people like Matthew Hughes, who testified about losing his wife and living for years not knowing why. Mike's voice softened slightly. Matthew was incredibly powerful on the stand. He wasn't angry or dramatic. He was just honest. He talked about Allison, her laugh, her love for teaching, the way she'd helped their sons with homework. He talked about the morning she collapsed, about telling their boys that their mother was dead, about the years of grief and confusion. And then he looked directly at Victor Malone, who was sitting at the defense table, and he said, you knew this medication was killing people and you did nothing. You chose money over my wife's life. How did Malone react? He didn't, Mike said. He sat there with the same expression he'd had the entire trial, calm, confident, untouchable. That's the thing about people at his level. They've insulated themselves so thoroughly from consequences that even facing a courtroom full of families whose loved ones died because of his decisions, he couldn't muster genuine remorse. What about the political connections? Were you able to introduce any of that evidence? Limited amounts. We got in some of the campaign contribution data, enough to suggest that Meridian had significant political influence. We showed that congressional hearings had occurred around the time of Cooper Ellis's whistleblowing attempts, and that those hearings had emphasized reducing FDA regulatory burdens. But we couldn't prove direct coordination without the sealed documents. Mike paused, and I saw something shift in his expression, a tension that suggested we were approaching the turning point. The trial lasted 5 weeks. Both sides presented their cases. The jury heard from dozens of witnesses, reviewed thousands of documents, sat through expert testimony about pharmacology and statistics. And then on the 29th of April, 2024, the case went to the jury. How long did they deliberate? 3 days, Mike said, the longest 3 days of my professional life. You never know what a jury is thinking. We'd presented what I believe was overwhelming evidence, but Meridian's defense had been sophisticated. They'd planted seeds of doubt, suggested alternative explanations, questioned our experts' credibility. It could have gone either way. He pulled out a document, and I saw the heading, Verdict Form Hughes et Alien v. Vor, Form Hughes and Alia v. Form Hughes and Alien Vor, Meridian Pharmaceuticals. On the 2nd of May 2024 at 3:47 inches the afternoon, the jury returned with their verdict. Mike slid the document across the table, and I read the key lines. Question 1, did Meridian Pharmaceuticals knowingly conceal information about the risks of CardioSafe? Answer, yes. Question 2, did this concealment cause harm to the plaintiffs? Answer, yes. Question 3, did Meridian Pharmaceuticals act with deliberate indifference to human safety? Answer, yes. You won, I said. We won liability, Mike corrected. The jury found that Meridian had knowingly concealed the risks, that this had caused the deaths, and that they'd acted with deliberate indifference. It was a complete victory on the core questions. But Mike's expression remained carefully neutral. But the verdict was only the beginning. What happened next? The penalty phase, the appeals, the backlash, that's where the real fight began. Because once we'd proven that Meridian was liable for 5,000 deaths, the question became, what was an appropriate punishment for a company that had valued profit over human life? He gathered the documents back together. The jury would be asked to decide damages, compensatory damages for the family's losses, and punitive damages, punishment designed to deter future misconduct. Meridian was facing potential liability in the billions of dollars. Their entire corporate structure was at risk. They must have been terrified. They should have been, Mike said quietly. But here's what I learned about companies like Meridian. They're never more dangerous than when they're cornered. We'd won the battle, proven their guilt, exposed their conspiracy. But the war was far from over. He looked at me directly, and I saw both determination and wariness in his eyes. Because 3 days after the verdict, I received another message. Not a text this time, a phone call at 2 a.m. A voice I didn't recognize said, "You should have taken the settlement." Now, everyone involved in this case is in danger. The call had disconnected before Mike could respond. What did you do? I increased security for my team. I warned the families to be cautious. And I prepared for the damages phase of the trial, knowing that whatever came next, Meridian wasn't going to accept defeat quietly. Mike closed the folder containing the verdict form. Meridian. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that the verdict had triggered something much bigger than a corporate legal defense. The night that jury found Meridian liable, decisions were being made in boardrooms and offices far beyond Philadelphia, decisions about how far powerful people would go to protect themselves, and decisions about who would be sacrificed to make this case disappear. He paused and I waited, sensing that what came next would explain why he'd been so careful throughout our conversation, why he'd documented everything so meticulously. 2 weeks later, Mike said softly, something happened that proved we weren't just fighting a pharmaceutical company anymore. We were fighting a system that would do anything to protect itself. What happened 2 weeks after the verdict? The threat becomes real. Mike's hands were steady as he poured himself water from the pitcher between us, but I noticed he checked his phone before continuing a habit I'd seen throughout our conversation, as if he was expecting news he hoped wouldn't come. 2 weeks after the verdict, he began, I was working late at my office. Around 9 p.m., most of my team had gone home, but I was reviewing documents for the damages phase. My phone rang, caller ID showed it was Tessa McCarthy. He paused, and I saw the memory of that call reflected in his expression. She was crying, could barely speak. She kept saying, they found me, they found me. I tried to calm her down, asked her what happened. She told me that when she'd gotten home from work that evening, her apartment had been broken into. Was anything stolen? Nothing. That's what terrified her. Her laptop was still there. Her jewelry, her electronics, everything of value was untouched. But her files were gone, personal documents she'd kept as backup copies of what she'd given us. And there was a note on her kitchen table. Mike pulled out a photograph of a handwritten message on plain white paper. You testified that was a mistake. Disappear, or we'll make you disappear. I told Tessa to pack a bag and leave immediately. Didn't matter where, just somewhere public and safe. Then I called the police, filed a report, requested protection for a witness in a federal case. You know what they told me? What? That without evidence of an actual crime breaking and entering without theft doesn't constitute a credible threat. Apparently, they couldn't provide protection. They took the report and suggested she get an alarm system. His voice carried a bitterness that I hadn't heard before. That same week, Matthew Hughes called me. Someone had been following him. He'd noticed the same car behind him 3 days in a row, different times, different routes. When he tried to get the license plate, the car disappeared. His sons noticed someone taking photographs of their house. Matthew asked me point blank, is my family in danger because we wouldn't take their money? What did you tell him? The truth, that I didn't know, but that we were dealing with people who'd already proven they'd go to extreme lengths to protect themselves. I arranged for private security, paid for it out of my own pocket. but I had 847 families in this case. I couldn't protect all of them. Mike opened another folder, this one containing incident reports. Over the next month, we documented 23 separate incidents involving our clients or witnesses. Break-ins with nothing stolen, vehicles tampered with, anonymous threats. Kendall Harper's daughter received messages on social media showing pictures of her daily routine where she bought coffee, which gym she attended. Logan Martinez found his brakes had been cut. A veterinary clinic where one of our witnesses worked was vandalized, and files specifically related to her testimony were destroyed. Did you report all of this? Every single incident. Local police, FBI, federal prosecutors. I provided documentation, witness statements, the obvious pattern showing these weren't random crimes. And I was told repeatedly that without direct evidence linking these incidents to Meridian Pharmaceuticals, there was nothing they could do. Coincidence, they said, urban crime, bad luck. The phrase seemed to echo through the conversation, bad luck, the same words doctors had used to explain deaths that weren't accidental at all. But you knew it wasn't coincidence. Of course not, neither did the families. But knowing and proving are different things. Meridian was smart enough not to leave fingerprints. They hired contractors who hired contractors. They used encrypted communications. They made sure that anyone investigating would find no direct connection between corporate executives and the intimidation campaign. Mike pulled out an internal email that had surfaced during discovery. This was sent by Eric Sutton, Meridian's attorney, to Victor Malone 3 days after the verdict. It says, witness management strategy requires immediate implementation. Recommend engaging approved vendors for comprehensive approach. It doesn't explicitly say harass and threaten our opponents, but the intent was clear. How did you get that email if they were being so careful? Because someone inside Meridian was still feeding us information. The same person who'd given us the flash drive with congressional communications, we'd receive occasional encrypted messages with new documents, usually things that showed just how far the company was willing to go. Did you ever figure out who your source was? Mike shook his head. No, and honestly, I didn't try too hard. Whoever it was risking everything to help us. The less I knew, the safer they were, but the information they provided was invaluable. But it showed us the strategy Meridian was implementing. He spread out several more emails, a timeline of corporate decision-making after the verdict. They called it crisis management, but it was really a coordinated campaign to make the case go away. Legal appeals, obviously they filed those immediately, arguing everything from jury instructions to evidentiary rulings, but they also launched what they termed alternative resolution strategies. That included the intimidation we were experiencing, but it went further. How much further? They began targeting our experts. The doctors and scientists who testified about CardioSafe's risks started facing professional consequences. Research grants mysteriously didn't get renewed. Speaking invitations were canceled. One of our epidemiologists found himself under investigation by his university for alleged research misconduct, claims that were eventually dismissed as baseless, but not before his reputation was damaged. Mike's expression hardened. They also went after me personally. Stories started appearing in legal publications questioning my ethics, suggesting I'd manipulated clients for financial gain. A complaint was filed with the State Bar Association alleging that I'd violated professional conduct rules. It was all nonsense, but it was designed to create doubt, to make people question whether this case was really about justice or just about a lawyer trying to get rich. Did it work? It scared some people. 3 families withdrew from the case, accepting individual settlements with confidentiality agreements. Meridian offered them enough money that they couldn't refuse, not out of greed, but because they were terrified and financially exhausted. I didn't blame them. They'd already lost loved ones, and now they were being threatened and harassed. Taking the money and trying to move on made sense, but most stayed. Most stayed, Mike confirmed. Matthew Hughes actually became more committed. He told me, if they're working this hard to shut us up, it means we're close to something they're really afraid of. We can't stop now. He was right. The intimidation campaign told us we were on the right track. Mike closed the folder and looked at me directly. The damages phase of the trial was scheduled to begin in late June. We had to present evidence about the value of lives lost, the pain and suffering of families, and most importantly, what punitive damages would be necessary to actually punish and deter a company like Meridian. We were asking for $15 billion. I felt the weight of that number. How did you arrive at that figure? It was calculated based on Meridian's net worth, their annual profits from CardioSafe, and what it would take to actually hurt them financially. Anything less would just be a cost of doing business. We needed a number that would force real change, that would make other pharmaceutical companies think twice before hiding safety data. And Meridian's response? They argued it would bankrupt them, put thousands of employees out of work, destroy shareholder value. They painted themselves as victims of an overzealous legal system. But we had documents showing the company had set aside $8 billion in reserves specifically to cover potential liability from CardioSafe. They'd planned for this. They'd known the reckoning was coming. Mike leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. But here's what we didn't know, what we were about to discover, was that Meridian's preparation went far beyond setting aside money for settlements. They'd been building a network of protection that extended into the highest levels of government. And when that network was finally exposed, it would reveal a conspiracy that made everything we'd uncovered so far look small by comparison. He paused, and I sensed we were approaching the revelation he'd been building toward. 3 days before the damages trial was supposed to begin, I received a package. No return address, delivered by courier. Inside was a single document, a memo from the Department of Health and Human Services dated the 15th of May, 2024, 2 weeks after our verdict. What did it say? Mike pulled out a copy of the memo marked confidential internal use only. It was a directive from the Deputy Secretary of HHS to the FDA Commissioner. It instructed the FDA to conduct an expedited reevaluation of CardioSafe's safety profile and to issue a statement clarifying that the medication's benefits outweighed its risks when properly prescribed. The memo specifically mentioned our case and described it as misleading public perception of an essential cardiac medication. I stared at the document, understanding the implications. They were trying to undermine your verdict. Worse than that, Mike said, they were using a federal agency to provide Meridian with ammunition for their appeal. If FDA issued a statement supporting CardioSafe's safety after our trial, Meridian could argue to the appeals court that the jury's verdict contradicted expert federal regulatory findings. It would give them grounds to overturn everything we'd won. That's government interference with a judicial proceeding. Yes, and it was about to get much worse. Because when we started investigating who had requested that memo, we discovered something that connected everything, the FDA corruption, the congressional protection, the intimidation campaign, all of it to a single source. Mike's expression was grave, and that source had the power to make our entire case disappear. The air in the conference room felt heavier as Mike opened what he'd labeled his red folder documents, so sensitive that he'd kept them separate from everything else. I could see the care with which he handled them, as if they were both precious evidence and potential danger. The HHS memo was signed by Deputy Secretary Bryce Chambers. He said, I didn't know much about him initially. Career bureaucrat, appointed 18 months earlier, relatively low profile. But when our researcher Josie started digging into his background, we found something interesting. He pulled out a personnel file. Before joining HHS, Bryce Chambers spent 12 years as a senior executive at a pharmaceutical consulting firm called Sterling Health Advisors. Want to guess who their biggest client was? Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Meridian paid Sterling Health Advisors over $200 million during Chambers' tenure there. He personally managed their regulatory strategy account. When he left to join the government, he received a $4.7 million severance package, unusually generous for someone taking a public service position that paid $180,000 a year. Mike laid out a timeline showing Chambers' career trajectory alongside key events in the CardioSafe saga. Chambers joined HHS in January 2023. 3 months later, Cooper Ellis's safety review of CardioSafe was permanently shelved. 6 months after that, the FDA issued new guidance on post-market surveillance that made it harder to flag safety signals for approved drugs. And now, 2 weeks after our verdict, Chambers was directing the FDA to rehabilitate CardioSafe's image. That's the revolving door everyone talks about. But this was more than just regulatory capture. This was active sabotage of a legal case by a government official with direct financial ties to the defendant. When we brought this to the attention of the judge, Meridian's attorneys argued that HHS policy decisions were beyond the court's jurisdiction, that Chambers was entitled to exercise his regulatory authority regardless of pending litigation. What did the judge say? Judge Caprio was furious. He ordered a hearing to examine whether there had been improper coordination between Meridian and HHS. But before that hearing could happen, we received another package from our anonymous source. Mike pulled out a thick stack of documents, each page marked with highlighting and notes. This was the smoking gun. Email communications between Victor Malone and Bryce Chambers sent to their personal email accounts, not official channels. The emails showed that Chambers had been in regular contact with Meridian throughout his time at HHS. They discussed our case specifically. Chambers provided advance notice of regulatory actions. He gave Meridian guidance on how to respond to FDA inquiries. And most damning, he helped coordinate the timing of the HHS memo to maximize its impact on Meridian's appeal. I scanned the emails, seeing phrases like our mutual interests and managing the cardio-safe situation and ensuring regulatory alignment with business objectives. This proves corruption. It proves that a high-ranking government official was actively working to protect a pharmaceutical company from accountability while pretending to serve the public interest. But here's what made it even worse. Chambers wasn't acting alone. Mike laid out an organizational chart. We traced the communication networks and found that Chambers was coordinating with at least 4 other officials across HHS and FDA. They created what was essentially a protection network for Meridian. When our case started gaining traction, they activated this network to provide regulatory cover. Who else was involved? The FDA commissioner at the time was Wesley Ford. We found evidence that he'd been briefed on Chambers' plan and had approved the expedited reevaluation of CardioSafe. 2 division directors at FDA who'd previously worked in the pharmaceutical industry were also part of the coordination. And then there was someone at the White House, a health policy advisor named Declan Harmon, who'd been monitoring our case and providing political guidance. The scope was staggering corruption that extended from a pharmaceutical company through regulatory agencies to the White House itself. When we presented this evidence to Judge Caprio, what was the response? The judge immediately issued an order blocking the FDA from releasing any statement about CardioSafe while the case was pending. He referred the matter to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation, and he made a statement from the bench that I'll never forget. Mike pulled out the court transcript and read directly from it. Judge Caprio said, "This court has presided over many cases involving corporate misconduct, but I have never seen a conspiracy that extends so deeply into the institutions meant to protect public health. If these allegations are proven, they represent not just a failure of regulation, but a betrayal of the public trust that strikes at the heart of our democratic system." That must have sent shockwaves through Washington. It did. Within 48 hours, Bryce Chambers resigned from HHS, citing personal reasons. Wesley Ford announced his retirement from the FDA. Declan Harmon was reassigned to a different portfolio at the White House. They were all abandoning ship, trying to distance themselves before the criminal investigation gained momentum. Did Meridian finally realize they were going to lose? Mike's expression suggested the answer was more complicated than that. Meridian's stock price dropped 34% in the week after the corruption was exposed. Their board of directors held an emergency meeting. There were calls from shareholders for Victor Malone to step down. But here's the thing about institutional corruption, it's resilient. Meridian had spent years building relationships, making donations, creating dependencies. They weren't going to go down without taking others with them. What do you mean? 3 days after the resignations, Congressman Ashton Bishop, remember him, the one who'd held hearings criticizing FDA regulatory oversight, he gave a speech on the House floor. He called our case a witch hunt and accused me of conducting a politically motivated attack on an American business and the dedicated public servants who regulate our healthcare system. He demanded an investigation into how we'd obtained confidential government communications. He was defending them. He was trying to change the narrative. Instead of focusing on the corruption, he wanted to focus on us, how we got the documents, whether we'd broken laws, whether this was really about justice or about destroying a successful American company. It was a last-ditch effort to create confusion and doubt, Mike pulled out another document, this one, a letter on congressional letterhead. Bishop sent this letter to the Attorney General, formally requesting an investigation into my conduct and the conduct of my legal team. He suggested we'd engaged in illegal procurement of classified government documents and conspiracy to interfere with federal regulatory processes. It was absurd on its face, but it created headlines. Media outlets started questioning our methods instead of focusing on Meridian's crimes. How did you respond? We held a press conference, put every piece of evidence on public display. Matthew Hughes stood with me, along with 20 other families who'd lost loved ones. We showed the internal Meridian documents proving they'd known about the deaths. We showed the emails between company executives and government officials. We let the families tell their stories, real people who'd suffered real losses while a pharmaceutical company and corrupt bureaucrats prioritized profits and political relationships over human lives. Mike's voice carried conviction that hadn't been there at the start of our conversation, as if reliving these moments had reconnected him with the core purpose that had sustained him through the fight. The press conference changed the conversation. Suddenly, it wasn't about my methods or whether we'd been too aggressive. It was about 5,000 dead people in a system that... How did Meridian respond? Mike's expression darkened slightly. They appealed, of course. The case is still in the appellate system. They're arguing the punitive damages are excessive under constitutional standards, that the jury was biased by the political scandal. They've managed to delay payment while the appeals proceed. But here's what they can't appeal away. The truth is now public. Everyone knows what they did. He leaned back, and I saw exhaustion mixed with satisfaction in his face. But winning the verdict and the damages award wasn't the end, because what we'd exposed, this network of corruption connecting pharmaceuticals, regulators, and politicians, it was bigger than one case. And the people we threatened by bringing it to light weren't going to simply accept defeat. What happened? 2 weeks after the damages verdict, my anonymous source, the person who'd been feeding us documents throughout the case, they reached out one final time. They sent a message that said, "You need to know what's coming. They're not done with you. And they're not done with the families." Mike's hands, which had been steady throughout our conversation, tightened slightly on the edge of the table. The message included one more attachment, a document showing that Meridian had hired a crisis management firm with connections to intelligence contractors. The firm specialized in what they called comprehensive reputation, rehabilitation, and opposition neutralization. And according to the document, they'd been given an unlimited budget to make our case go away by any means necessary. He looked at me directly, and I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly, but a wariness that suggested the fight was far from over. That's when I realized the verdict was just the beginning of a much longer battle, and that everyone involved in exposing this conspiracy might be in more danger now than we'd ever been before. The late afternoon light was fading through the conference room windows, but neither of us had moved to turn on additional lights. Mike's face was partially shattered as he opened the final folder, the one he'd placed at the bottom of the stack, as if he'd known this would be the hardest part to discuss. After the damages verdict, the attacks on our witnesses and clients intensified, he began. It wasn't random harassment anymore. It became systematic, targeted, designed to break people down psychologically and financially. He pulled out a log. He'd kept dates, incidents, victims. That lay... Tessa McCarthy, our key whistleblower, was arrested on fabricated charges of stealing proprietary documents from her former employer. The charges were eventually dropped, but not before she spent a night in jail and had to hire a criminal defense attorney she couldn't afford. Kendall Harper's daughter lost her job after her employer received an anonymous tip that she was under investigation for fraud, a complete lie. But by the time it was cleared, she'd been unemployed for 3 months. This is retaliation. It's more than retaliation. It's a coordinated campaign to punish anyone who stood against them and to send a message to others who might think about doing the same. Logan Martinez's small business suddenly faced an IRS audit. Matthew Hughes found himself denied a mortgage refinancing he desperately needed. These weren't coincidences. They were attacks disguised as bureaucratic processes. Mike's voice carried a weariness that suggested these weren't just abstract legal violations, but personal failures he felt responsible for. I tried to protect them, hired security consultants, connected people with pro bono legal help, paid for some expenses out of my own pocket, but I couldn't shield them from everything, and the psychological toll was devastating. People who'd shown incredible courage in testifying, who'd stood up to a billion-dollar corporation, they were being ground down by endless harassment. Did anyone break? 5 more families settled privately and withdrew from the case. I couldn't blame them. They'd already lost loved ones to CardioSafe, and now they were losing their financial stability, their privacy, their peace of mind. Meridian offered them settlements with confidentiality clauses and immunity from the harassment. It was extortion disguised as generosity. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But then something unexpected happened. The media attention from the trial, the exposure of government corruption, it created public pressure that even Meridian couldn't fully control. Investigative journalists started looking deeper into pharmaceutical industry practices. Congressional representatives who weren't compromised began calling for reforms. And other victims, people who'd lost loved ones to CardioSafe but hadn't been part of our case, they started coming forward. Mike pulled out a map marked with pins across different states. Within 3 months of the verdict, we'd been contacted by families in 37 states. The total number of confirmed CardioSafe deaths wasn't 5,000, it was closer to 8,000. Meridian's internal projections had been conservative. The actual body count was significantly higher. And every new case that surfaced added to the pressure for accountability. What did you do with all these new cases? We couldn't represent all of them. My team was already stretched beyond capacity. But we connected people with other attorneys, helped them file individual cases, provided guidance on evidence and legal strategies. The litigation became a hydra. Meridian would settle one case, and 3 more would appear. They must have realized they couldn't win this war of attrition. They were facing catastrophic liability. The $18.5 billion in punitive damages from our case, plus potentially billions more from additional lawsuits, plus the criminal investigations of their executives and the government officials who'd protected them. Their stock price had collapsed. Major institutional investors were divesting. The board of directors was in open conflict with management. Mike pulled out a news article dated November 2024. In late November, Victor Malone was forced out as CEO. The board announced a restructuring and brought in outside leadership to restore confidence. CardioSafe was voluntarily pulled from the market, not because Meridian suddenly developed a conscience, but because the legal liability had made it financially untenable to keep selling. They spun it as prioritizing patient safety, but everyone knew the truth. That must have felt like vindication. It felt like what it was, too little, too late. We'd won in court, we'd exposed the corruption, we'd forced them to stop selling the drug, but 8,000 people were still dead. Families were still grieving, and the systemic problems that had enabled this to happen, the revolving door between industry and government, the influence of pharmaceutical money in politics, the weaknesses in our regulatory system, those were still in place. Mike's expression suggested someone who'd won the battle but understood the war continued. The victory we achieved in Hughes versus Meridian was significant. It proved that even the most powerful corporations and their political protectors can be held accountable if enough people refuse to be silenced. But it also revealed how hard that accountability is to achieve, how many resources it takes, how much courage is required from ordinary people who are already suffering. What happened to the $18.5 billion in damages still tied up in appeals? Meridian is arguing constitutional limits on punitive damages, claiming the award violates due process. The appeals court will likely reduce it. That's standard in cases with large punitive awards. But even if they cut it in half, it's still a devastating penalty that will reshape how pharmaceutical companies think about risk management and regulatory compliance. He gathered the documents into neat stacks, his movements methodical. The families will eventually receive compensation, though it'll take years to work through the legal system. But I've told them all the same thing: no amount of money brings back the people they lost. The value of what we accomplished isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the drug that's no longer killing people, the executives who are held accountable, the regulatory reforms that might prevent the next disaster. Do you think this will change the industry? I think it put a spotlight on practices that were allowed to operate in darkness. Other pharmaceutical companies are now reviewing their safety protocols, knowing that what happened to Meridian could happen to them. Regulators are more cautious about their relationships with industry. Politicians are more careful about their pharmaceutical donations. But fundamentally changing a system that's built on the intersection of profit, politics, and regulatory capture, that requires more than one lawsuit. Mike closed the last folder and looked at me directly. This case consumed 3 years of my life. It cost me relationships, sleep, any pretense of work-life balance. I received death threats. I was investigated by regulatory authorities. My reputation was attacked in the press. And I do it all again. Because at the end of the day, we told the truth about what happened to 8,000 people whose deaths were dismissed as bad luck when they were actually preventable tragedies caused by corporate greed. What's next for you? There are other cases. Other drugs with hidden risks, other companies cutting corners and hiding data, other families who deserve someone to fight for them when the system fails. I've become the attorney that pharmaceutical companies fear, and honestly, I'm okay with that. Someone needs to be willing to take on these fights. He stood, and I sensed our conversation was nearing its end. The silent toxin wasn't just cardio safe. It was the corruption that protected it, the regulatory failures that enabled it, the political interference that concealed it. We exposed that toxin to light. Whether that's enough to prevent the next disaster, only time will tell. Mike walked to the window, looking out at the city below. But I know this Matthew Hughes was right when he said, we can't stop. Because if we accept settlements and sign confidentiality agreements and let powerful institutions silence the truth, then the next 5,000 people will die and nobody will know why. And I refuse to let that happen on my watch. He turned back to face me, and I saw in his expression the determination that had carried him through years of this fight. 3 months after the damages verdict, while we were fighting the appeals and dealing with a harassment campaign, Matthew did something remarkable. He organized the families, called it the Cardio Safe Justice Coalition, started with just the people from our case, but it grew quickly as more families came forward. What was the coalition's purpose? Solidarity first, making sure nobody faced the intimidation alone. If someone was being harassed, others would literally show up at their house, document what was happening, provide support. Meridian had been picking people off one by one, but when the families united, that became much harder. Mike pulled out newsletter from the coalition, printed on simple paper but filled with stories and photographs. But it became more than just mutual protection. They started advocating for legislative change. Matthew testified before Congress about the need for stronger pharmaceutical oversight. Kendall Harper worked with patient safety organizations to push for mandatory adverse event reporting. They turned their grief into action. How did Meridian respond to that? They tried to ignore it at first, then they tried to discredit it. Their PR firms put out statements claiming the coalition was being manipulated by trial lawyers seeking profit. They suggested the families were too emotional to understand the complex science of drug safety. It was condescending and offensive, and it backfired spectacularly. Mike showed me media coverage of a press conference where families confronted Meridian's new CEO directly. The families held a demonstration outside Meridian's headquarters in New Jersey, brought photos of their loved ones, told their stories to every journalist who would listen. The new CEO, a guy named Simon Briggs, had been brought in to clean up the mess. He came out to address them. Big mistake. What happened? Matthew looked him in the eye and said, your company calculated that my wife's life was worth less than your quarterly profits. You can hire all the PR firms you want. You can put out all the statements about commitment to safety, but nothing changes the fact that you chose money over human lives. And we're going to make sure everyone knows it. Mike's voice carried respect as he recounted the moment. The video went viral, millions of views across social media. Suddenly, this wasn't just a legal case buried in court documents. It was a human story that resonated with people. Other families affected by pharmaceutical negligence started organizing. Patient advocacy groups joined the cause. The coalition became a movement. That must have put enormous pressure on Meridian. It did more than the lawsuits alone ever could. Because you can fight legal battles with lawyers and money, But you can't fight mothers and fathers and children standing in front of cameras saying this company killed my family. The emotional truth of that cuts through all the corporate. Paused. He paused, and I saw the determination that had sustained him through years of this fight. That's when I knew we were going to win not just the legal case, but the larger battle for accountability, because the families had found their voice, and they weren't going to be silenced by threats or money or political connections. They'd transformed from victims into advocates, and that was something Meridian had no strategy to combat. Mike gathered the coalition materials back into a folder, but Meridian wasn't done fighting. They had one more card to play a strategy so ruthless that even I didn't see it coming. And when they played it, it nearly destroyed everything we'd built. I leaned forward, needing to understand what could possibly be more ruthless than what Mike had already described. He seemed to read my expression and nodded slowly. In January 2025, as our appeal was moving forward and the criminal investigations were intensifying, Meridian filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection, Mike said quietly. They claimed the litigation had made them insolvent, that they couldn't continue operations while facing unlimited liability. But you said they'd set aside billions in reserves. They had. The bankruptcy was strategic, not genuine. It was designed to consolidate all the litigation into one bankruptcy court where they'd have more control over the outcome. In bankruptcy, they could force a global settlement on their terms, discharge the punitive damages, and emerge with a clean slate. It's a tactic pharmaceutical companies have used before Johnson, and Johnson did something similar with their talc litigation. Mike's voice carried frustration at the legal maneuvering. The bankruptcy filing triggered an automatic stay on all litigation. Our case, the criminal prosecutions, everything stopped while the bankruptcy court took control. Meridian proposed a settlement plan. They'd create a trust fund with $5 billion to compensate all victims, but in exchange, all punitive damages would be discharged. All criminal prosecutions would be resolved with corporate fines instead of individual accountability, and the company would continue operating under new ownership. $5 billion sounds like a lot. Divided among 8,000 families, it's about $625,000 per death. Compare that to the $18.5 billion jury verdict we'd won. They were using bankruptcy to escape 75% of their liability. And the families would have no choice in bankruptcy. Creditors have to accept whatever plan the court approves. How did the families react? They were devastated. Matthew called me the night the bankruptcy was announced. He said, "We did everything right. We exposed them. We won in court. We proved what they did. And now they're going to use the legal system to cheat us again." I didn't have a good answer for him. Mike pulled out legal briefs from the bankruptcy proceedings, but we fought it. We argued that Meridian's bankruptcy was filed in bad faith, that they had sufficient assets to pay the judgments, that this was an abuse of the bankruptcy process. We brought in forensic accountants who showed that Meridian had transferred assets to subsidiaries before filing, that their claims of insolvency were manufactured. Did the bankruptcy judge buy it? Judge Judy Shinlin, no relation to the TV personality, she was skeptical of Meridian's claims from the start. She ordered extensive discovery into the company's finances, and what we found was exactly what we suspected. Meridian had deliberately structured their bankruptcy to shield assets while claiming poverty. Mike showed me financial documents that revealed the scope of the manipulation. They'd moved $12 billion worth of patents and intellectual property to a subsidiary not included in the bankruptcy. They'd paid out massive bonuses to executives right before filing. They'd transferred overseas accounts beyond the reach of U.S. courts. It was a shell game designed to make them look broke while protecting their most valuable assets. What did Judge Shinlin do? She denied their settlement plan, said it was a transparent attempt to evade liability and that she wouldn't allow her court to be used to help a company escape accountability for killing thousands of people. It was one of the most strongly worded rulings I've ever read. She called their conduct morally bankrupt as well as financially dubious. Mike's voice carried satisfaction at the memory. With the bankruptcy plan rejected, Meridian had no choice but to negotiate a real settlement. We spent 3 months in mediation representatives from all the family groups, Meridian's new leadership, the bankruptcy trustee, even observers from the Department of Justice. It was brutal. Long days arguing over numbers that represented human lives. What was the final settlement? $14.2 billion into a compensation fund. CardioSafe permanently removed from the market worldwide. Meridian required to implement independent safety monitoring for all their other drugs. The company's executives agreed not to oppose criminal prosecutions in exchange for the settlement being approved, and critically, no confidentiality clause. The families could talk about what happened. The documents would remain public. The truth would stay visible. He paused, and I saw the complexity in his expression, relief, mixed with recognition that no amount of money truly made things right. It wasn't everything we'd want at trial, but it was real accountability, more than most families in these situations ever receive. And it came with a requirement that Meridian establish a $500 million fund for pharmaceutical safety research and victim advocacy, turning their misconduct into something that might prevent future tragedies. Mike closed the financial documents. The settlement was approved in April 2025, 6 years after Allison Hughes died taking a medication her doctor assured her was safe. 6 years of investigation, litigation, intimidation, and fighting through every obstacle Meridian could construct. But we'd won. Not just a legal victory, but real change. His voice dropped slightly, but there was still one more revelation coming. Something that would explain why Meridian had been so desperate, so ruthless, so willing to risk everything to keep this covered up. Because CardioSafe wasn't their only deadly secret. The settlement should have been the end of the story, but Mike's expression told me there was more. He pulled out one final folder, thinner than the others, but somehow more ominous. 2 weeks after the settlement was approved, our anonymous source contacted us one last time, Mike said. They sent a message that said, you stopped CardioSafe, but you need to know there are 2 other Meridian drugs with the same safety issues, same cover-up pattern, same body count. This was never about just one medication. The revelation hit like a physical blow. All the fighting, all the deaths, all the corruption, it wasn't an isolated incident. It was standard operating procedure. The source provided preliminary data on 2 other Meridian medications, NeuroClear, an antidepressant, and R3 Relief, a pain medication. Both showed elevated rates of adverse events that weren't being properly reported. Both had internal safety reviews that had been suppressed. The pattern was identical to CardioSafe. How many deaths? We're still investigating, but preliminary estimates suggest at least 2,000 for NeuroClear and 1,500 for R3 Relief. If those numbers are accurate, Meridian's total body count isn't 8,000, it's closer to 11,500 people. Mike's voice carried exhaustion mixed with renewed determination. We immediately contacted the FDA, the Department of Justice, the bankruptcy trustee. The settlement had included provisions for handling additional claims if other safety issues emerged, but nobody expected it to be this extensive. Judge Sheindlin reopened the bankruptcy proceedings to address the new allegations. Where does that stand now? New litigation is underway. Families affected by NeuroClear and R3 Relief are coming forward. The criminal investigation has expanded to cover all of Meridian's safety practices, not just CardioSafe. And there are calls in Congress for comprehensive pharmaceutical reform, mandatory independent safety monitoring, stricter penalties for data concealment, limits on the revolving door between industry and regulators. Mike leaned back, and I saw the weight of years of fighting in his posture. Victor Malone, the former CEO, is facing criminal charges, so he'll likely spend time in prison. Several other executives have already pled guilty to lesser charges. Bryce Chambers, the HHS Deputy Secretary, is under indictment for corruption. Congressman Bishop lost his re-election bid after his ties to Meridian became public. There's actual accountability happening. Does that feel like justice? It feels like a start, Mike said carefully. But justice for 11,500 dead people? I'm not sure that exists. What we have is acknowledgement, accountability, and hopefully prevention. The families got compensation. The truth became public. The company and its enablers face consequences. That's more than most victims of corporate crime ever receive. He gathered his documents, a physical manifestation of years of work. Matthew Hughes told me something after the settlement was finalized. He said, I'll never get Allison back. No amount of money changes that. But knowing that other families won't lose their mothers, their wives, their daughters to CardioSafe, that means something. That makes the fight worth it. Mike's voice softened. That's what I hold on to when this work gets overwhelming. The idea that exposing one company's deadly practices might make other companies more careful. That families who would have suffered in silence now have a voice. That the system, despite all its flaws, can sometimes be forced to work. What happens next? The litigation continues. The criminal cases proceed. The families rebuild their lives with the compensation they received. I move on to the next case, the next family, the next fight against corporate power that values profit over human life. He stood, and I sensed our conversation was finally nearing its true conclusion. But I'll never forget this case. Never forget the 11,500 people whose deaths could have been prevented if someone at Meridian had chosen differently. Never forget the families who showed incredible courage in demanding accountability. And never forget that the fight for justice, real justice, never ends. Mike walked to the window one final time, the fading daylight casting long shadows across the conference room. When he turned back to face me, I saw something different in his expression, not just the determination of a lawyer who'd won a historic case, but the weariness of someone who understood that victory was incomplete. The CardioSafe case revealed something Americans need to understand, he began. Our system of pharmaceutical regulation, the agencies meant to protect public health, the politicians meant to oversee them, the companies meant to prioritize safety, it's been compromised by money and power to the point where catastrophic failures like this are almost inevitable. He returned to the table, sitting down with the weight of finality. Meridian Pharmaceuticals wasn't an aberration. They were the logical result of a system that allows drug companies to fund the studies that approve their own medications, that lets industry executives rotate into regulatory positions, that permits unlimited pharmaceutical lobbying and campaign contributions. They played by the rules of a corrupt game. So what needs to change? Everything, Mike said bluntly. We need truly independent drug safety monitoring, not assessments funded by the companies being evaluated. We need to end the revolving door between pharmaceutical firms and the agencies that regulate them. We need criminal penalties severe enough that executives actually fear personal consequences for hiding safety data. And we need politicians who prioritize public health over campaign contributions. His voice carried the passion of someone who'd seen the human cost of systemic failure. But more fundamentally, we need people to understand that this isn't about being anti-pharmaceutical. Medications save lives every day. But the current system incentivizes companies to maximize profit rather than maximize safety. When the penalty for hiding 11,500 deaths is less than the profit from keeping a drug on the market, companies will keep making that calculation. We have to change the math. Do you think the reforms being discussed in Congress will actually help? Some will. Mandatory reporting of adverse events with serious penalties for noncompliance, that's essential. Longer waiting periods before regulators can work for companies they oversaw, that helps reduce conflicts of interest. Better funding for FDA safety monitoring so they're not dependent on industry fees, that's crucial. But real change requires political will, and political will requires public pressure. Mike pulled out the photograph of Matthew Hughes and the other families one more time. That's why the family's decision to keep fighting publicly matters so much. Every time they tell their stories, every time they push for reform, they remind people what's at stake. They make it harder for politicians to accept pharmaceutical money without consequences. They create the pressure that makes change possible. What do you want people to take away from this story? Mike considered the question carefully. I want them to understand that 11,500 people are dead because a pharmaceutical company made a business decision that profits were more important than human lives. I want them to know that this happened not in some distant, corrupt country, but here in America, with oversight from our regulators and protection from our politicians. And I want them to realize that it will happen again unless we demand better. He paused, his expression grave. But I also want them to know that ordinary people, grieving families, determined whistleblowers, committed attorneys can fight back and win, that even against billion-dollar corporations and corrupt officials, the truth matters. That accountability is possible if enough people refuse to accept injustice. What's your message to other families facing similar situations? Document everything. Trust your instincts. Find allies who'll fight with you. Don't accept convenient explanations when the evidence suggests something more sinister. And understand that the fight will be harder and longer than you imagine, but it's worth it not just for yourself, but for all the families who will come after you. Mike gathered his folders for the final time, years of investigation and litigation reduced to paper that would eventually be archived. The silent toxin killed thousands, but the real poison was the corruption that protected it, the regulatory capture, the political interference, the corporate culture that treated human lives as acceptable costs. We exposed that poison, we held people accountable, we forced change, but the work continued.